The day my father died, the ground under my life cracked open, and I did not understand yet that the person standing closest to me was already preparing to push me into it. My father was not just a parent. He was the center of everything solid in my life: discipline, money, structure, reputation. He built an empire from nothing, taught me how to work without excuses, how to read people without trusting them, how to keep family matters inside the family. When his health collapsed, I became the executor of his daily affairs, but not of his final decisions. He made those alone, in silence, while I believed I still had time. My wife stood beside me during the funeral arrangements, efficient, calm, almost professional. She handled documents, phone calls, condolences. People praised her strength. They told me I was lucky to have such a capable woman in my darkest moment. I nodded and accepted their words because grief leaves little room for suspicion. I mistook her focus for loyalty. That mistake would cost me years of my life. The reading of the will came 2 weeks later. I expected complexity, percentages, trusts, conditions. My father loved control. What I did not expect was simplicity that felt like a blade. The bulk of his estate, valued at roughly $25 million, had been left not to me, not to a family trust under my management, but directly to my wife. The room went silent, but inside me something screamed. My name appeared only in secondary clauses, living arrangements, a modest stipend, a delayed review after several years. Everything important passed through her hands. The lawyer explained it with rehearsed calm. My father believed my wife was more stable, more practical, better suited to preserve the legacy. He feared I was too emotional, too close to him, too likely to make impulsive decisions after his death. I did not argue. I did not object. I told myself my father knew what he was doing. I told myself marriage meant shared destiny. I told myself money moved inside a family, not away from it. These were lies I needed to survive the moment. The divorce papers arrived less than 3 months later. There was no build-up, no attempt at counseling, no prolonged tension. 1 week we discussed renovations on a property that technically no longer belonged to me, and the next week I was informed, through legal channels, that my marriage was over. The timing was not accidental. It was calculated with the same precision my wife used when she balanced accounts or negotiated contracts. She moved fast. Accounts were separated. Properties were re-registered. Advisors changed. I was reduced from husband to liability in a matter of days. The inheritance that once represented my father's life work was now positioned behind legal walls I could not touch. That was the moment my grief transformed into something sharper. Not rage, not panic, not collapse. Understanding. The truth did not come all at once. It came in fragments, details that only made sense when assembled. A long-standing relationship between my wife and my father's financial advisor. Private meetings I was never informed about. Legal documents drafted long before my father's death, during periods when I believed his decisions were still fluid. Conversations held behind my back, framed as concern for the future, for stability, for protecting assets from what they called emotional risk. I was that risk. My father did not suddenly choose my wife over me. He was guided there, gently, patiently, with fear and logic. He was convinced I would self-destruct under the weight of inheritance. He was told she would protect me by controlling everything. She did not protect me. She positioned herself. When the full picture finally settled, my marriage was already gone, my father was already buried, and my name had been carefully removed from the center of my own life. I lost my home first. Then access to companies I had helped manage for years. Then social standing. Invitations stopped coming. Business partners became cautious. Friends avoided choosing sides by choosing distance. I became a reminder of something unpleasant, a man who had everything and lost it without a scandal, without a public fight, without noise. Quiet losses disturb people more than loud ones. What my wife did not understand was that she had taken assets, not capability. She had taken position, not knowledge. She had taken money, not leverage. I started over in a way that did not look like starting over. I kept my routine. I kept my discipline. I kept my silence. While she consolidated power, I studied the architecture of it. While she believed the story was finished, I treated it as the first chapter of a longer process. The inheritance was clean on paper but fragile in structure. It relied on advisors, managers, contracts, and relationships that still remembered my father and recognized me as his son. Influence does not disappear just because ownership changes hands. It only waits for pressure. I did not challenge the will. I did not run to court screaming betrayal. I did not expose private correspondence. I let her believe she had won something final. People who think they have reached the end stop guarding the path behind them. Every system has weak points. Every legal fortress is built by humans who make assumptions. My wife assumed I would react emotionally. She assumed I would fight loudly or disappear quietly. She assumed wrong. By the end of that first year, I was no longer trying to recover what I lost. I was building something parallel, something she could not see, something my father would have understood far better than she ever did. The inheritance destroyed my life only once. I would not allow it to do so twice. The second year after my father's death was the year people stopped watching me. That was not an accident. Visibility is dangerous when you are weak and useless when you are underestimated. I made sure I looked harmless. I downsized, changed routines, withdrew from circles where my name once carried weight. From the outside, it looked like decline. In reality, it was filtration. I mapped everything my wife now controlled. Not emotionally, not nostalgically, but mechanically. Which companies depended on which suppliers? Which board members were loyal to the legacy rather than the legal owner? Which managers stayed because of contracts and which stayed because of history? Money moves through people before it moves through accounts, and people always leave traces. She replaced my father's structure with something smoother, more corporate, more detached. Quarterly performance mattered more than long-term stability. External consultants replaced internal memory. On paper, it looked modern. In practice, it created fractures. I reconnected quietly with individuals who had been pushed aside. Senior engineers whose opinions were no longer invited. Regional directors removed in the name of optimization. Lawyers who had been paid to draft documents but never asked whether those documents would survive pressure. These were not allies yet. They were sources of understanding. At the same time, I rebuilt my own financial footing. Not through inheritance, not through sympathy, but through work that had nothing to do with my father's empire. Smaller investments, private partnerships, operations designed to stay invisible. I learned again how to operate without a safety net, something my father had forced me to master long before money ever came into my life. The divorce finalized faster than expected. My wife had no interest in prolonging it. The faster I was legally separated from her finances, the cleaner her ownership became. She wanted certainty. Certainty makes people careless. Her public image evolved quickly. Widow-like respectability turned into confident independence. She hosted events, sat on panels, gave interviews about stewardship and responsibility. My father's name followed her like a credential. Mine faded into background context, mentioned only when necessary. What she never noticed was that she had inherited an empire built on patience, not speed. My father grew slowly because he understood cycles. She pushed aggressively because she trusted numbers more than time. That difference mattered. Pressure started appearing where she least expected it. Long-standing partners hesitated to renew exclusive contracts. Key suppliers demanded renegotiation. Regulatory reviews intensified. None of these events pointed back to me. They looked like coincidence, like market shift, like the cost of growth. I made sure of that. I did not attack the core. I stressed the edges. Meanwhile, I documented everything. Not accusations, not emotions, but sequences. Dates. Decisions. Deviations from established governance. Instances where fiduciary responsibility bent toward personal consolidation. I was not collecting revenge material. I was preparing leverage. There is a difference between revenge and correction. Revenge destroys. Correction rebalances. I was not interested in burning the inheritance. I wanted it aligned again with the principles my father claimed to value, even if he had failed to apply them to his own family. The truth about the will continued to surface through indirect confirmations. My father had been guided, not coerced. He had signed willingly, but under selective information. He believed he was protecting me by removing temptation. He believed my wife would remain my partner, not my replacement. He miscalculated her ambition and underestimated my restraint. Understanding that did not absolve him. It clarified him. And clarity is more useful than forgiveness. By the middle of the year, my wife began restructuring at a scale that required external financing. Expansion always needs justification, and justification always invites scrutiny. New investors demanded transparency my father never allowed outsiders to have. With transparency came exposure. Quietly, through intermediaries, I positioned myself where decisions slowed. Where approval stalled. Where trust required verification instead of assumption. I did not need control. I needed friction. Her legal team grew. So did her confidence. She believed resistance came from conservative forces resisting progress. She framed herself as a reformer. That narrative worked publicly. Internally, it created division. I stayed absent. No interviews. No statements. No dramatic gestures. Absence, when paired with competence, unsettles people more than confrontation. She began to reference me indirectly, framing the past as something she had outgrown. She wanted closure. I was not done. By the end of the second year, the inheritance still sat firmly in her hands, but its momentum had slowed. Costs increased. Margins tightened. Loyalty thinned. Nothing collapsed, but nothing flowed freely anymore. The machine continued to operate, but it no longer felt inevitable. I was no longer trying to get back inside it. I was building a position from which I could decide whether it deserved to keep running the way it was. My life no longer revolved around loss. It revolved around timing. And timing, unlike money, always returns to those who wait. The third year was when the balance began to shift, quietly enough that only the people inside the structure felt it. By then, my wife had stopped seeing the inheritance as something she was temporarily holding. It had become her identity. The companies, the assets, the influence attached to my father's name were no longer a responsibility she managed but proof of her own competence. That belief made her predictable. She centralized control. Layers of approval were removed in the name of efficiency. Decisions that once required consensus now required only her signature or the signature of people whose positions depended entirely on her favor. From the outside, it looked decisive. From the inside, it removed insulation. When problems appeared, they pointed upward. The first serious fracture came through financing. Expansion had been aggressive, and revenue projections assumed conditions that no longer existed. Markets tightened. Partners became cautious. A refinancing round that should have been routine turned difficult. New terms carried obligations my father would never have accepted. That was when my name started reappearing, not publicly, but in conversations that mattered. Board members began asking whether the original structure had been too radically altered. Longtime partners asked whether the current leadership still reflected the values they had trusted for decades. No one accused her directly. They asked about continuity. Continuity is a polite way of questioning legitimacy. I did not insert myself directly. I allowed intermediaries to do that work. People who knew me before the inheritance shifted, who remembered how decisions were made when my father was alive. They did not argue that I should return. They argued that something had been lost. At the same time, the documentation I had gathered started to matter. Not as a weapon, but as a mirror. When regulators requested clarification on governance changes, the answers did not align cleanly. When auditors examined advisory relationships, conflicts appeared that had never been disclosed. None of this was illegal on its own. Together, it formed a pattern of consolidation that raised questions. Pressure does not need to explode to be effective. It needs to be constant. Privately, my wife began to react. Not with panic, but with irritation. She hired additional consultants, replaced legal teams, pushed harder. Each response increased operational cost and reduced trust. People could feel that decisions were no longer about growth but about control. That was when she made her first mistake toward me personally. She reached out indirectly, through mutual acquaintances, testing whether I was open to closure, to moving on, to letting the past remain the past. The message was not reconciliation. It was a request for silence. Silence from someone who had not spoken in years only matters if it is no longer guaranteed. I did not respond. Silence, when it is expected, is comfort. Silence, when it is requested, is leverage. The inheritance was now a weight she carried alone. Advisors stopped cushioning reality. Numbers no longer supported confidence. Investors wanted reassurance she could not give without acknowledging instability. A system built on certainty does not adapt well to doubt. Behind the scenes, options began circulating. Restructuring. Partial divestment. Bringing in legacy representation to restore confidence. My father's name was no longer enough. People wanted someone who understood the structure from the inside, not just the balance sheet. That was the opening. I positioned myself not as an heir demanding restitution, but as a stabilizer offering continuity. Not publicly, not emotionally, but strategically. I did not challenge her ownership. I questioned sustainability. By the end of the year, formal conversations began without her presence. Advisory groups explored scenarios where leadership adjusted without litigation. Control did not need to change hands completely. It only needed to rebalance. She still believed I was reacting to the divorce, to the humiliation, to the loss. She did not understand that I had moved past reaction long ago. This was no longer about her. It was about correcting a structure that had drifted from its own foundation. The most painful realization for her came when she understood that no dramatic betrayal had occurred. No single person had turned against her. The system itself had rejected imbalance. I did not take anything from her at that stage. I did not expose her. I did not demand apologies. I waited while options narrowed. By the time she realized I was no longer outside the conversation had already changed. The inheritance had not returned to me yet. But it was no longer truly hers. The final shift did not happen with confrontation, exposure, or public collapse. It happened the way real control always changes hands, through paperwork, fatigue, and the quiet acceptance that resistance costs more than compromise. By the 4th year, the inheritance had become a liability instead of a trophy. Growth targets were missed. Financing costs rose. Boards grew cautious. Advisors stopped promising solutions and started presenting exit strategies. The structure my wife had built required constant pressure to hold together, and pressure exhausts the person applying it. When formal restructuring was proposed, it came dressed as prudence, not defeat. Partial divestment. Leadership realignment. Restoration of legacy oversight. These phrases sounded neutral, but they carried a clear implication: the system no longer trusted unilateral control. My role was introduced as temporary, technical, and non-threatening. Oversight. Continuity. A bridge. I accepted those terms because bridges decide who crosses and when. I did not need titles. I needed access. Once inside, everything moved faster. Processes were simplified. Redundant consultants were removed. Long-standing managers were reinstated. Contracts were renegotiated with people who remembered my father and respected predictability more than ambition. Confidence returned gradually, then visibly. My wife watched this from a distance she could no longer close. She still owned assets on paper, but authority had shifted. Decisions no longer passed through her alone. Influence does not vanish overnight. It drains. The final rebalancing came through valuation. Assets were restructured into holdings where performance, not ownership, determined control. My position expanded because I delivered stability. Hers contracted because she resisted adaptation. No court forced her hand. Economics did. Eventually, she agreed to a settlement that would have been unthinkable years earlier. Not because she felt remorse, not because she wanted peace, but because the alternative was watching the inheritance decay under her watch. She chose preservation over pride. The money did not return to me as a single, dramatic reversal. It returned as governance, as authority, as direction. The empire was no longer hers to command. It was no longer mine to inherit blindly. It became what it should have been from the beginning, a structure built on balance, not manipulation. I did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. My father remained dead. My marriage remained over. Time did not rewind. What changed was alignment. The system was back on track. Decisions reflected long-term survival instead of short-term control. The name attached to the legacy carried meaning again, not just value. I did not reclaim my old life. I built a different one, grounded in awareness rather than assumption. My wife moved on publicly, quickly, and loudly. New ventures. New narratives. She never acknowledged what happened, and she never had to. Outcomes speak without explanation. People sometimes ask whether I consider what I did revenge. I do not. Revenge seeks to wound. I sought to restore order. The inheritance was never the point. Control without understanding is always temporary. Power borrowed through manipulation always expires. She believed she had won because she held everything at once. I won because I waited until holding everything no longer mattered.